All right, back again, guys. Strap in because I have been trying to make this a shorter video, but it's going to go on for a little while. We're going to talk about, I know this is not exactly the typical gym videos I've been making, but it is health related, and there's going to be some useful insights from it. I'm sure that if you're a gym bro, a pretty good portion of you are also probably gun bros. I think those crowds kind of run together a lot of times. But we're going to talk about how I got lead poisoning, okay? And not only are we going to talk about how I got lead poisoning, but all the precautions I took to avoid lead poisoning, and I still got some. I think it could have been a lot worse if I hadn't taken these precautions. And we'll also go over, I did take blood tests throughout this kind of experiment. It was, it's an N of 1 study. It's just me. This isn't extremely scientific, but I did do some things to kind of measure my levels of lead exposure. And we'll talk about kind of how it happened, why it matters. And there will be some insightful pieces of information from this. So I did get lead poisoning. I knew I would to an extent. The whole point, my whole goal was just to kind of mitigate and kind of lower the exposure I had to lead as little as possible. So about 2 years ago, I was in the police academy, and maybe we'll do some videos on police stuff eventually. I really don't have the time to get into that serious of a topic. I will someday, but it's not going to be today. This is more to focus on. We're not going to talk about the police academy or anything crazy like that, or policing in general. This is really just to talk about lead exposure from shooting guns. During the police academy, there was a 3-week block of intensive shooting and weapons handling. It was 3 weeks total, 5 days a week for 3 weeks, 8 hours a day. During that, there's a ton of not just firing, but weapons handling, moving and shooting next to people. You're getting a lot of gun smoke from not just your firearm, but other firearms nearby. There's also a lot of, this is like boot camp style academy. So we're not just shooting stagnantly in the range. We're also getting down in it in the range. When somebody fucks up, does something stupid, we're doing push-ups, sit-ups, we're working out on the range floor, we're rolling around in it. And we're also doing a lot of handling of range equipment that's like covered in lead. So the exposure to lead during this period was quite high, and it was quite sustained. So I knew that there was going to be really no way around it. And I wanted to do my own personal assessment to see what kind of lead exposure I actually got. And I tried to do everything I possibly could to negate any kind of lead poisoning. And we'll go into all those things here. And it's going to sound pretty long and autistic, and it is. The whole point of it was to be as extreme. The whole point was to be as careful as possible and to negate lead exposure to the absolute extreme and see if I did and how bad my lead exposure was at the end of the training. So a couple things why this matters. So look, I still, while I find that nowadays lead exposure from shooting is talked about a lot more. When I was growing up, nobody talked about it. I only recently, over the last few years, even started thinking about, and I'm a health conscious guy, only recently did I start thinking about the severity of lead exposure from shooting guns. And even now when I talk to a lot of guys, when we're talking about shooting and watching some gun tube stuff, people are like really, a lot of people are like really surprised whenever I bring up the notion of getting lead poisoning from shooting, and a lot of people like look at me kind of wide-eyed, like they've never thought about it before. I think it's an important thing. I think it's more well known than it used to be, but it is a topic that I know that a lot of people still don't take that seriously. But the fact of the matter is, like, lead is extremely hazardous. It is poisonous. And you should take it seriously. You don't want any of that, not only in your system, but in any of your loved ones' systems. You don't want to bring that home if you've got kids and have them exposed to that, because that's going to do irreversible, serious damage. Even small amounts of lead poisoning to a child is catastrophic. So why for me I took this so seriously. You can see I live, we're not living in luxury here, guys. This is a pretty small apartment. I mean, the gym is luxurious, but this is what I'm stuck with. I'm going to be here I've been here for a while. I'm going to be here for a little bit longer. And being in a small apartment, once you introduce contaminants into like an enclosed space this small, it's very difficult to get that out of there. And you're honestly probably not going to get it out of there. And if you do, it's not going to be easy. So the thing is like I knew going into this academy that there was going to be an intensive range portion of it. And I was going to be exposed to quite a lot of lead. And I didn't want to bring any of that back into my apartment, bring it back to my wife. And with her trying to get pregnant, and us having a child on the way, I didn't want there to be hardly any lead I was bringing in from work into this household. Because I'm not going to accept any amount of exposure of lead to my kid. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the types of exposure. So it's not, like I said before, it's quite a sustained block of time. And it's not just, stagnant shooting. You're cleaning the guns, disassembling them quite often. You're also moving and shooting a lot. You're doing a lot of, you're getting very intimate with the weapon. You're doing a lot of workouts and smoking sessions in the range. And there's just no escaping it. You're handling a lot of range equipment. You're running around, as fast as you can with, lead plates, or not lead plates, steel plates covered in lead fouling. Everything you're doing, it's like an atomic bomb of lead exposure. There's just really no way around it. A good thing I will say is the ranges we used were all outdoors. So a large portion of a lot of lead poisoning in ranges comes from shooting in indoor ranges with poor ventilation. So that was at least good for me. These were all outdoors. It was very cold because we did this in the winter. It was freezing at times, but I'd take that over being in enclosed space, shooting thousands of rounds a day, any day. So now let's talk about some of the precautions I took. And I would love for somebody to add, if I missed a precaution I could have taken, I want somebody to tell me. Because I did absolutely everything I possibly could to limit my exposure to lead. We're going to go down this list. It's quite intensive. It's going to seem really autistic and OCD, but I tried to do absolutely everything I could do to limit lead exposure. So the first is, like I said before, this is during the winter. So I would have done this if it was in the summer as well, but I was always wearing multiple layers of clothing. I was always wearing long sleeves, and on top of the multiple layers of clothing and long sleeves, we were wearing hats when we were doing a lot of shooting. So that was limiting some of the exposure to the hair, which would grab onto a lot of lead particulates. Also gloves. I tried to shoot with gloves when I could, not only just to get used to shooting in gloves, because that is something that's necessary, but a main thing I did was whenever there was any type of cleanup going on, whenever we were picking up the thousands of casings that we had shot by hand, obviously we're picking up by hand. That's, I'm sure there are better ways to do it, but you're not supposed to, it's a boot camp. Okay. So you're down on your knees, picking up all the shell casings by hand. I made sure at all times that I had some extra latex gloves with me, and I would put those on whenever I was handling large amount of spent casings, because I'm sure you guys already know, but a huge portion of lead poisoning from shooting actually comes from the spent casings. There's a lot of areas the lead poisoning comes from, but a lot of it is from the actual spent shell casings. Those were just completely contaminated in lead. So we had the clothing, we had the gloves. Another thing, obviously, is hand washing. Not only was I hand washing, when I could, always before eating, always before using the restroom, and then just intermittently throughout the day when I had time. I was also hand washing with D-lead soap and also using D-lead wipes. So I wasn't just using water. I was also using specific products that are used to, bind to the lead and try to shed that from the skin so that it doesn't get absorbed. On top of the lead wipes, and look, people thought I was fucking crazy at the range for being this specific about lead contamination, but I stuck with it because I wanted, this is serious shit to me. Um, Another thing is I had range specific clothing. So I had already decided beforehand that I was going to use clothes that after the range, they were going to fucking get thrown away. Never going to use them again because I knew they were just going to be so contaminated with lead and they were going to have such a high lead exposure. So I had range specific clothing. And not only did I just have range specific clothing, but at the end of each range day, I would change outside in the parking lot in the freezing cold into a pair of fresh, clean clothes, discard my shoes, and I put the dirty clothes in the shoes and clothes compartments inside my car. That way, when I was in my car in the driver's seat going home, I'm limiting any exposure that's still on my clothes or still on my body, trying to keep it out of the cabin of the vehicle. And then because, my wife, my kids are someday going to be in that car, and I don't want there to be any lead in the car, and then also bring that lead from the car into the home. So I was really limiting like the exposure from not just the range, but also tracking that from the range into my house. On top of that, every day when I got home from the range, I would wash with D-Lead body wash and D-Lead shampoo. And on top of that, I wouldn't really call them cold showers, but they were definitely lukewarm. I wanted to avoid hot water because I didn't want my pores to open up and potentially absorb more lead into the system. I know that's kind of extreme, but I'm an extreme guy, and those are the precautions I took. So not only am I washing my whole body and my hair with D-Lead soap and shampoo, I'm using cold and lukewarm water to try to limit any absorption. On top of that, I was always starting the day off with fresh clothes at the range. Also washing my range clothes every few days with D-Lead detergent, because I wanted to make sure every time I went to the range, I was as clean as possible. And then when I got home, I'd shampoo, I decontaminate, I'd do everything I could. I wasn't going to bring any of that into the rest of the house or in my car and all that. On top of that, when I was cleaning my gun after the range, because there's going to be gun inspections in a range, in an academy like this, I would actually drive all the way over to my parents' house. Luckily, they were not too far away. I would use their garage since I don't have a garage. I would clean the gun in there in range, in dirty. I would clean the gun in dirty clothes, take those clothes off as well when I was done, and try to keep that. I was never cleaning the gun inside my apartment. I was always cleaning the gun either at this separate garage or I was cleaning the gun at the range. On top of that, any type of cut I got, either if I got it from Glock bite or if I just, it was cold and my hands were cracking, I would immediately be covering those with Band-Aids. Yeah, because any type of open wound, that's going to be a huge exposure to lead. So look, I had the clothing covered. I had gloves. We're hand washing. We're using D-Lead wipes before we eat. I was also making sure. I also made sure. Another thing we also did is they had this was good on them. They had a room that was that was kind of separated from the range, that was for lunch. So not only am I washing my hands, before lunch, I'm at least not also eating like your lunch where you be like cleaning firearms and things like that. So now let's go through the test results. So you've got to understand, I did this because I wanted information for myself at the time. I wasn't thinking about making a video or anything like that. This was just for me personally. I was curious about what kind of lead exposure I would have and if all these precautions would actually make a difference. So it's not like this is the most scientific thing ever, but there is still some good information I think we can glean from what I did. So I tried to establish a baseline before the range even started. And sadly, I went to the lab, I got my blood drawn, and then I got an email a couple of days later saying they had messed it up. So I wasn't able to get a really good week before the range baseline. So even though the blood test from before the range got botched, when I decided to make this video, I did go out last week and I got another baseline drawn. I know it's 2 years later, but my lifestyle is generally the same. I haven't had any crazy recent exposures that I know of to lead. My blood test last week showed a baseline of my levels are at 1.2 nanograms per deciliter. I feel like that's probably a good metric to show where I was before the range. I wish I could be lower. 1.2, I'd rather it be under 1, but that's something. But I did get a blood test at the end of week 1 and at the end of week 3. So at the end of the first week of the range and at the very end of the range, I got another blood test. So the reference range is, you have to remember that lead, there's no good there's no good amount of lead that you can have. You should strive to have a lead level of 0 nanograms per deciliter. Now, probably nobody's going to have that because there's always going to be some lead in the environment, but you want to keep it as low as possible. What I've seen now is the reference range is generally accepted as anything less than 3.5 nanograms per deciliter is considered safe. Now, it's not safe to have a level of 2, but it's just not going to have catastrophic consequences and catastrophic health effects, especially if you're an adult. If you're a kid, it's going to be even more severe. And I've also seen from other labs and from other people I've seen on YouTube and around that whenever they get their blood tests, it also seems like other labs are using this reference range of anything less than 3.5 nanograms per deciliter is considered in range. But at the end of week 1, I had a level of 2.3 nanograms per deciliter, which is in range, and I was pretty impressed with that. I will preface, though, that at the end of week 1, there had not been a whole lot of shooting going on. I can't remember. It's been almost 2 years now. I can't remember exactly how much shooting, but I know the very beginning of the range, you have to understand, is just mostly dry firing and weapon handling. We're not doing a lot of live shooting. I've been shooting guns my whole life. I'm very comfortable with guns. I know how they work. I've always been around guns. I've always shot guns. I've always had guns. You have to understand, with like a police academy setting, you've got people who have never shot a gun a day in their life before coming in. So you do have to kind of start from scratch, from the very baseline with people. So the end of week 1 was 2.3 nanograms. I was pretty happy with that. And at the end of week, I didn't get a blood test for week 2. I did get a blood test at the very end of week 3, and that did show signs of lead. That did show a level of lead poisoning, and I've got my results right here. That showed me at 6.7 nanograms per deciliter. So that it is, almost twice what the acceptable level is. Here's what I will say. There's a couple things to take away from this. So while that is technically lead poisoning, I actually think the efforts I put in did a pretty good job at mitigating the level. I wish, I was kind of looked at as like a freak for doing all this lead prevention stuff at the range. I wish, there was somebody who hadn't done any of the precautions I did, had taken theirs at the end so we could kind of compare. But we'll go over some other people on YouTube I've seen who've had their levels checked. We'll kind of compare it. But I feel like 6.7%, it shows you that, or 6.7 nanograms per deciliter, it shows you that even with all the insane precautions I took, there's just no avoiding, you can help prevent it, you can help to mitigate it, but ultimately shooting is toxic when it comes to lead, and there's just really no going around that. And that's not to say that like you should just you should freak out and stop shooting guns. It's just that you just take it seriously and be smart about it and be safe, because like this stuff does. I think a lot of people think this shit doesn't matter. If you don't want to think that, that's fine. But like with me about ready to have children, and I have a family I want to raise, there's no amount of lead that I want in my life. Okay, I'm not okay with any. I want to have as little of that as possible. A couple things we can take away though. I had looked at 2 other people on YouTube. There's this guy, Jared AF, I watch a lot. I wouldn't say I watch a lot, but I watch some of his videos on guns. I think he's pretty fun to watch. He's got some interesting little videos. He had gotten his lead levels checked, and he had registered at 18 nanograms per deciliter. I'm sure he's doing a lot of shooting. I also heard in his video he mentioned he reloads, so he's doing a lot of lead handling. But 18 is quite high. That's over 6 times the reference range. And then there was also a second YouTuber I watched he had a video from a few years back, Alpha Concepts or Alpha Kinetics. I'll put it below. He was actually having severe physical symptoms. He didn't know it was lead poisoning at first, but he was having like severe physical symptoms. He thought it might have been like some type of arthritis. And he got his checked, and his levels were shown to be in the mid 20 nanograms per deciliter. So I say that to kind of show how, while I had a quite large and sustained exposure to lead from shooting, I do think the extreme precautions I took did help to mitigate it some. I still got lead poisoning, but it could have been a lot worse. So this is just something to keep in mind. I don't know how much of the audience here is going to resonate with this, but this is just, and I know this isn't the most scientific thing ever, but there is useful information here. I also put in a lot of the products below, a lot of the links to them. If you want to if you do shoot guns or you are exposed to lead in some way, some products that you can kind of use to decontaminate yourself and your clothes and things like that. I think I've always got some stuff here in the apartment for like when I do go to the range and when I do shoot, I make sure that I still have some type of decontamination process and try to stay, limit my exposure as little as possible. So you can kind of see how it steadily increases. And at the end of the 3 weeks, I am over the range into the lead poisoning level. Now, I didn't notice any deficits overtly. I'm kind of, I'm a pretty self-conscious person, and I'm pretty hypercritical. And, I kind of felt like I was thinking a little bit slower, but let's be honest, that's probably just in my head. I at least didn't have any physical symptoms from the lead poisoning. I didn't feel like I was having any headaches or any weird pains or anything overt that would shout lead poisoning. But yeah, no, I mean, if you guys have any precautions that I missed, feel free to comment below. Or if if you've had some type of lead exposure from shooting, I think this is an interesting topic. I like talking about it with people. But yeah, just let me know.